Graham Lewis. I'm the Partnership Development Manager for Healthwatch, and we are the champion for people who use health and social care. And I'm here with
Katie Chapman,
who is a person of lived experience of being a carer. One of the projects we have at our Healthwatch is we support a carers partnership board, which brings together carers, whether they be caring for a parent, sibling, adult child, young child, person, sibling as in they are a young carer themselves. It's to hear the voices of those people, their experiences and the people that they talk to, and we meet with providers of services, the charities, and also with statutory services about their direct provision, but also what they can commission if gaps are identified in services and so on. Katie has been very involved in the board for many years and very kindly agreed to talk about the importance of the voice of people getting involved, but using her experience to talk about this. So, Katie, can we take you back to the start of your journey? How long have you been involved or engaged with social care?
about 28 years, I suppose. My son is now 38, and a week before he was 3 he had a seizure, the first one that we'd witnessed. Not long after that he was diagnosed with epilepsy and started medication to control it. Then he started primary school, had been in nursery school before then and was actually keeping up with his peers then. When he was 5, the medication stopped controlling his epilepsy and he started having more seizures, so he had to go on more medication. During the next couple of years, because he went on more medication to control his seizures, he started to be out of line with his peers' development. He was then assessed for an educational statement of need. It was a SEN at that time. By the age of 7 he was on quite a few anticonvulsants, and we don't know whether the seizures were causing him issues with his learning or whether it was the side effects of the drugs that were causing issues with his learning. The medication also impacted on his behaviour, and he was excluded from school for a period of time because of his behaviour as a result of the drugs. We now know in hindsight that the drugs, certain drugs have a negative effect on his ability to have any self-control on his behaviour. At the age of 10, this was before inclusive education, there was a big meeting in the education world. Now everything was separate back in those days, so education met separately to health and social care. And it was thought the best solution because inclusive education wasn't a given in state schools, that he should go to a specialised school. And after a period of looking at all the different provisions, the choice was to place him in a school 40 minutes away from home. But it was a residential school, and we had him home at weekends and holidays. But that wasn't what when we first had children, thought would happen in our lives, that our son wouldn't be living with us again from the age of 10. It was a sad time because, on a Sunday night I put him to bed in his bed at school and I didn't see him again until Friday afternoon when I picked him up. He has a younger sister, 3 years younger, and around this time his epilepsy was really difficult for him, and he was having periods of time when he was having what they call status, where you have continuous seizures and you're admitted to hospital. And that was the first time I really came to have any conversations with social care. Up to that point, we had really only been involved with health and education as two separate entities. I had not really recognised that our lives were not the same as other people's families, and the amount of care that I was giving my son was over and above what other families with 10-year-old son would be giving. And I spoke to a social worker on the ward at the hospital when we were inpatient for a longer period of time, and she asked me to sort of talk to her about where we were at, and she was very gentle with me, and she was very kind and explained, this is over and above the norm. It's very hard when you're going through this experience to see what else, where things are different, and actually you do need a bit of help. I was also in a situation where my daughter then developed when she was 10, 3 years later, a condition that caused her to be wheelchair bound. And so having already sort of been made, social service been aware of us, I was able to then contact someone and say, look, I need some respite now. When Mark is home, then I need to be able to do certain things for my daughter, which I can't necessarily, when she's in the wheelchair, also support Mark with his epilepsy. So I'd always been a bit frightened of engaging with social care, because when the children were younger, there was a lot of publicity about the negative sides of social care, and how, and this is kind of late 80s, early 90s, how social care was all about removing children. And so it's really scary, I think, when you think you're not coping, but you don't want to say you're not coping, and so you do your best because you're worried. I mean, it has already been sort of excluded from a lot of our lives, but to be taken elsewhere, or for us to be seen as being capable.
It's the complex emotions. If he hadn't had epilepsy, hadn't had educational needs, you would have been needing all those supports. But because of those things, the feelings that it creates of not coping must be really difficult, because as a parent, that must be, not doing the job right must be one of the hardest feelings to have, because it is, as we all know, parenting is not easy, and we can all look at our own parents and go, I wouldn't do it like that, and then catch ourselves doing exactly the same thing, because that's the way of the world. We know it's not easy, but to know when you're not coping so well must be really hard, and admitting to that, all the complex emotions that go into it.
Yeah, there's as a mother, I think you feel guilt from the day they're born, that you're responsible for this little person, and you can't always satisfy that need. Whether they're, when they're a newborn, they're crying, you can't make out why they're crying, because you've done everything that should satisfy them, to the point where, why should my son have such a difficult time? And watching him have a seizure is very difficult for a parent. And the first time we saw him have a seizure, we thought he was going to die. And
not part of your life you'd had before, nothing you'd experienced. Why would you not think that?
And when he's been in hospital in status, they've been very clear that they would make a clinical decision about how much they would he would endure before they would make a decision about withdrawing the care, because of the clinical need not to allow someone to suffer, but against how much intervention you give.
Yeah.
So it's been a really emotional roller coaster, and you want to be, as you said, a good parent. You don't want to repeat the mistakes maybe of your parents, but there's a subtle knowledge about what they did right.
Yes.
As well, and trying to bring, and as as he's my eldest child, it was first time round, so I'm learning everything new with him.
Yes.
And unfortunately, he wasn't. There was lots of complication to what I needed to know, and I needed to know more about the condition and the education and his emotional well-being than I might have had to have known about my daughters.
You've talked about how challenging it was dropping your son into school and putting him to bed at school on a Sunday evening and then collecting him on Friday afternoons. Was there any positives about that?
So a sibling of a brother who needed extra support. So as a baby, fortunately, while she was a baby and up to about 2, his seizures were under control. And then things got worse. So her dependency on me became less as she developed her own independence. I mean, the 2, you can do a certain amount for yourself. Obviously, I wasn't abandoning her, but
Yes.
his needs got more apparent, and there would be times when I would have to say to my 4-year-old, "Can you just keep an eye on your brother because I need to use the bathroom?" And so she became a sibling with responsibilities. And she grew up really quickly, and you know, the reports that we had at the time was how mature she was as an individual. But the sacrifice was that she didn't get the attention she needed when she really wanted it. And our second siblings are always in that position, but more so with Mark. So when he was at school from Sunday night to Friday, she had access to me all the time, and her father when he came home, you know, in the evenings and stuff like that. But so she gained a benefit from that, and we got respite. But at the time, it's a double-edged sword because you don't want to accept respite when it's such a big chunk of your life with your child lost as a result of that. And then, you know, you can see that she benefited from that because academically she did well, and often that's the negative side of being a sibling with a child with extra needs in your family, that you don't thrive as well. And I think she thrived during those periods of time. But even still, she had a period of adjustment every time he came home.
Yes.
For her as well. More time with my daughter. I did use the time actually to go and find out more knowledge about how to be a parent of someone with a learning disability and epilepsy. I did read up because in the first 10 years, or the 7 years that we had epilepsy, it was very difficult to do any extracurricular. And I got to know more about social care, and I suppose that's when I became more aware of what was out there to support me.
Was there any particular courses that you did?
So I did attend a course in London. There was some really innovative projects going on about inclusion for children, and whilst Mark had missed the boat kind of thing, it was the start of changes to policy. So inclusion in schools was being developed and became policy. The disability arena was making everyone much more aware, wanting choice and control over their lives, and there were lots and lots of policies that went through around that between the late 80s and the 90s, which have developed social care and the rights of disabled people much more than there was prior to that.
What happened locally? Were you involved in anything locally?
So because of that kind of change in policy, there was an initiative to involve people who receive services in the decision making and the modelling of new provision. And I was invited, his dad and I were invited to join a group of parents to see how they could do it better with children's social care. and that was facilitated, and we went on a regular place to see that. And that work then evolved into the development of key workers as a provision, and also those key workers that were then working on the transition between adults, the children's services and adult services. And the goal was that when a child was 10 or 12, they would start a process of understanding how to move to adult services, which at the time was between 18 and 19. Now that is 25, and at that time also Mark was actually, because this all came about during the time he was at school. When he was 18, he chose to come home. He was one of the first children that actually had a key worker and a transition process applied to the last year of his children's services.
It's part of what I was under In Control pilot.
That's correct.
Yeah. So what were his goals? What was it he wanted to do once he hit the magic age of 18 and became an adult and in charge of his own life?
So when he did the piece of work with the transitional worker, he did what's called a path, and it looks at your goals, and then it goes back to how you can achieve those goals. And Mark's goals were to have a blue car, to live in his own flat, and to get rid of his epilepsy. They were the three key. There were a few others. And he didn't want to stay at the school. They do have an adult provision. He wanted to come home, but his main goal was to have his own flat. He's the eldest in our family group. Mark's got lots of cousins, and he's the eldest, and he always sees himself as being the first one to reach a rite of passage.
Yeah.
So having your own car was sort of number one. So he wanted to be as independent as possible, and the other things was he wanted to sort of maintain a relationship with family and friends. So the first thing we were able to do out of those goals was to apply for DLA, which is now PIP, and he was successfully awarded the higher rate, which allowed him to have a mobility card. And whilst he would never be able to drive, he can now, instead of relying on us to be available to drive him around, or for a taxi to turn up and then him not be able to attend somewhere because he's had a seizure and they can't wait for him to recover from it, and we didn't have a bus service in the village, so it meant he could come and go with his support when he wanted to go and when he was able to go. We then were fortunate enough, I did, by this time, joined the Carers Partnership Board. It didn't quite look like it does now, but there were regular meetings, and in those meetings I found out about initiatives and what was there on the horizon that I could tap into. So I started networking basically through the Carers Partnership. It's a two-way process. I'm informing them of what's working well for us, and they're informing me of what's on the horizon. So we tapped into the In Control pilot in 2005, and that was for 3 years, and that allowed us to be supported for Mark to achieve his goal of living independently. So as part of that process, we found out there were some flats being built north of Cambridge, which is kind of 15 minutes drive from us, which meant he could still have close connection to us.
Close enough.
Yeah, it's close enough, and for us to be able to be there fairly rapidly if we needed to.
Well, that full sense of, I do not live next door to my parents.
And he had a resource allocation done, and it was agreed that because he'd been at the school, that he had 24/7 care, that was something he needed resources for when he moved home. While he'd been at school, I'd found out through networking and the Carers Partnership Board that there was something called Circles Network, and we started a circle for Mark. And and that allowed him to express. It gave him a platform where I wasn't involved. I'd facilitate meetings, but I wouldn't be involved, and the only time they would come to me is for clarity about an appointment or the detail which Mark couldn't retain. And sometimes they had a meeting, it would be a mixture of friends. By this time he had support workers working for him, because Mark was allocated, was one of the first children to be allocated a direct payment when he left school for some respite for us while we were working, and to facilitate him going to sixth form and regional college to carry on his education. He could, in these meetings, be asked what he wanted, and his friends would say, well, you need to buy a fridge and you need a bed, and we'd slowly work around what he wanted in his flat and what it looked like without me coaxing him or making second guesses because I guesses because I know him. It allowed him to explore with other people what his future looked like, and that was brilliant. And I didn't want to be the only person who was saying what needed to be done, because I'm not his generation. It's a different world. It was a different world for him to live in to the one I'm living, or I was living at the time. His wants and desires are very different to mine. Ever since he was a child, he's played computer games. Well, that's not in my remit at all. Still isn't, and so it's little things like that, and little nuances that need to, for him to have a happy life. He moved into his flat in 2009, which was a great success, and if we'd not had that pilot and support from In Control, I'm not sure it would have happened otherwise. And we really did have a brilliant social worker who was on board for the whole time, so with us through that 5-year period around that. That made a big difference, the consistency and the support. But we do have to acknowledge that it was prior to constraints now that are in place because of budgetary things that happened from 2008, but they hadn't kicked in at 2009 quite, but not. And it was the very cusp of all of the direct payments, personalised budgets, personalisation agenda. So there was a big push, and Mark was fortunate to be on that wave. So what happened was we have a joint bank account, and I manage that, and I'm his court protection appointee for both his financial income, wherever that comes from, and his benefits, so the personal budget and so forth. I have fortunately got a background of finance, so it didn't actually faze me to do that and to do all the reporting. And I have a certain amount of knowledge of HR and health and safety, so I was able to effectively run a small business, which I've been involved in for most of my working life, in an effective way that's supporting Mark. I know that's been a barrier for other people doing direct payments because it's not their strength.
No, and a lot of people, that is the type of thing that actually puts them off doing it, either managing it for themselves or as a parent, carer, whatever title one wishes to use for somebody else. It also not wanting to do it because it's so much responsibility. So it is a
full-time job. It is a full-time job, and I think at the beginning they hadn't really recognised how much effort was involved. But it was kind of having Mark supported by full-time, 24/7, gave me the respite to do what I needed to do on the business kind of side of it. So he still lives in his flat. Prior to COVID, everything kind of not quite got going again. He volunteered. He's a DJ. He recently did DJing at 2 events in the disability arena. He's that's group activities. and it's social. So there's kind of, but he wants more of that. We've got to find out more for him now. Back again, there's been kind of a waning of what's out there because people's when COVID sort of allowed us to go out, we were still shielding and protecting, and and then those things go away because no one's attending.
It was
so it's hard.
Yes, the coming out of the COVID restrictions, those of us who shielded were still expected to carry on shielding and taking extra precautions because we were more vulnerable, or dealing with people who are more vulnerable. And then there was I can go to something, anxiety levels of no I'm not, which is, I think you've got to build back up. That confidence rebuild for people has been a challenge. So he's basically getting back on top of his life.
Social skills are very difficult for someone with a learning disability, and Mark's learning disability is about conceptual ideas and empathy and personal space and all these kind of things. So social skills that you haven't practiced for 2 or 3 years makes it really difficult then to go back into an environment and for it not to be too demanding on you as well as an individual, as well as how people respond to you because you're not fitting into the norm.
And I remember you telling me about he'd been involved in some Zoom calls and then he couldn't understand why he couldn't talk to the people on YouTube or TV because it was coming through the same box.
And the knowledge, the understanding that something's pre-recorded or something's live, just couldn't get that. It's not tangible. It's really not tangible. He still puts a CD into a CD player in order to play his DJ. He cannot grasp the concept that you can stream because it's not tangible.
Yeah.
So and it's the same with DVDs. He still will not look at a streaming DVD film when it's on his shelf where he can put it in. It's very hard for him to understand that. That's part of the learning disability.
You've mentioned that the pandemic changed everything. But was it just before, you've told me just before that you started to think different about where things were at? So
when we were on the personalisation journey, I was coming up to my 50s and I'm thinking along the lines of what Mark's trying to achieve, and I'm thinking, right, that's it. I can manage this. I can manage running this small business for him. Now 20 years on, it's 20 years now, so it's a different different proposition, and also I was thinking about this, as you say, pre-pandemic, about I was the single point of failure. If something happened to me, then although his dad and his sister, who's now in her 30s too, would pick up pieces, they didn't know the overall picture. And no one within the support team knew that too, because I was managing them. And whilst they knew some day-to-day stuff, there's as I've said, the nuances, the idiosyncrasies of things, and running payroll. If I wasn't able to do payroll, I would be affecting their livelihoods and their mortgages because they wouldn't get paid at the end of the month. And whilst there are mechanisms in place to pick up things like that, they all take time. And I felt really responsible, and I thought, right, now is the time to start formulating a plan to change things for my retirement. My retirement as in the state size, and my retirement from being Mark's manager and responsible for this. The pandemic really, because this was late in 2019, I started thinking this way, and seeing because I was 60 in 2019. Yeah, I have a 5-year window to maybe pass us over. Well, pandemic hit, and we were being sent advice that you need to write a contingency plan because your loved one will go into hospital without your support. You need to write an A4 piece of paper about what to do for this individual. And I'm thinking, well, I can't put everything on an A4 piece of paper about how to care for him if I was the one in hospital on a ventilator or didn't survive. So there is a really good document about moving on. There is an organisation holds this document, and I used it as a template. I started to fill it in as a contingency, and I then realised that I needed to get an organisation to take over what I was doing for my son's welfare and for the team. So I did some due diligence, and I ended up meeting with a couple of organisations. In the sort of 5 years that I'm talking about, there was branded about something called an individual service fund. And we actually had a presentation from someone from the County Council, Carers Partnership.
And it seemed to be the answer to the concerns that people had running direct payments for themselves. So they have the direct payments, but all the management is done by a company on their behalf. And it seemed to be the answer to whatever the reasons why people weren't taking direct payments, but as well as the answer to your how do I step away?
It gives you the ability, what I perceived from it was, it gave me the ability to pass over the day-to-day management, but still being involved in the checks and measures. And ultimately, if I felt that it was all going pear-shaped for Mark's well-being, I was still holding the budget. So I still had a certain amount of control on behalf of Mark, and that I didn't want to relinquish that because I still feel as a family we're the best people to advocate for him and to witness what's working well and what's not working well, and to highlight that. It was a pilot. The organisation that I've chosen after doing due diligence are a charitable non-profit, because I strongly believe that social care money shouldn't be used to line people's profit margins. There's so little out there, it should be used in the best way possible, because not only is this a little micro business that I'm talking about, but overall we've lacked workers who want to work in social care, the right budgets and so forth. Mark's budget hadn't been increased since he was 18. And I've been reluctant to put my head above the parapet and say, excuse me, but it now costs me so much to run this. I just did some shifts for nothing in order to compensate for the extra or the lack of complete funding. But I did put my head above the parapet. It was very scary to say, this is not now working, I need something else, because I think everybody who receives a budget is always worried that, and under scrutiny, that the eligibility criteria might have changed, and it might be harder to.
And I suspect also tap into the feeling you had when he was a child, not coping. And even though you now had a whole different experience of social care to the one that people would read about back in the 80s, 90s. And whilst you have the knowledge, it's still that sense of, it takes you straight back into that. You're not doing your best, but also you're acutely aware that our tax money is not enough to run a decent health service or social care provision in our county. And there are lots of other people out there who are just as, or even more worthy of the
the little money that's out there. So it's really hard to morally ask for more money, have a really good case and putting it together as well. That's hard because you have to qualify why you, and then you have to go through all of the emotional turmoil about actually acknowledging that the person you love, your little boy, who's not a little boy anymore, he needs all of this, and that his behaviour is challenging, and his epilepsy is life-threatening, and his learning is not going to get better. And it's about acknowledging that, and he's nearly 40, and it's kind of really emotionally tiring for a mother or a parent to do that, alongside make sure that he's still getting the services he needs, and that you can still be part of his life, and he enjoys life, and he's got as much choice and control over that life.
So everything is now being managed by this company, but with you having the oversight. Is that working for you? Is it still? It's
still in its early days, and going back to what I said earlier, and that is purely not their ability to do stuff. It's about enough people to do that stuff. So recruitment is really, really difficult. It's really difficult for an organisation. So it was even more difficult for an individual. Prior to 2019 in the pandemic, if someone resigned, I had them on 2 months notice period, 2 to 3 months notice period. I'd always be able to find the next person and get them on into the system. They might still be training, and they might still be shadowing before the other one left. So there was kind of a rollover, and I had quite good retention of staff. So at least 5 to 9 years I've had people. So it wasn't but then it all changed, and you'd lose someone and you couldn't find someone. So during the pandemic, there was plenty of time where, and that was really hard because we were actually caring for Mark maybe more than we had support caring for him. So that really then threw our relationship, because he'd left home, become independent, and then he'd become more dependent, because all children revert to type, even I do when I go home. So
that's what I was giggling for a little bit earlier. It's like, we don't want to be with our parents. We all go back to being a teenager. It's an automatic sensation, and treating our children as teenagers.
And so it's tough, and it was tough for the organisation, and I think we're just getting there now. We're just getting there, and it's a year. So the staff moved over last March, and it's 1st of March, the end of the week. So I'm fingers crossed. I can see light at the end of the tunnel, but I have I've started to stress to them, I don't want to turn 65 and it to not have moved forward. And that's only a couple of months away. Sort of giving them a bit of a deadline.
Got to have targets. So, has there been a recent, because we've been talking about your experiences at different points of where it's been, and actually it's quite emotional and challenging, and actually reflecting on those is not easy, so thank you. Has there been a recent experience of where you've just been able to be, because what you've been wanting to do is basically become mum, and have normal, whatever that means for anybody, relationship with both your children.
Yes.
And that. So it's been an experience where you've gone, this is what you do with your adult children. Yeah,
so I've recently become a grandmother, so that's nice that I can spend time with my grandson. There have been times when we have been with Mark and experienced something that's touched us, and so I went to play darts with him, and I've played darts with him before, but I've not been to the exact place that he goes with everybody on his team. I'd not supported him in that way, and I felt that I wasn't supporting him. I was, as you say, just mum. I was just the other player. I drove there and we had a game of darts and something to drink, and then we came home. But he had a new skill, or he did something that I'd never picked up on before, which was he took the boards where you score up, and he created this whole chart, so 10 lines down, 2 lines across, our names and everything, and he was using his phone to add up the scores. So he can't do mental arithmetic, and he finds it difficult. He'll use his fingers to add 5 and 5 together. So when it becomes more than that, it's quite difficult, isn't it? You've got 3 times. So, but he's learned over the last few years there's a calculator on his phone, and if he uses it, he can score up, and that's great, because it became a challenge between, I was trying to do it in my own school mentally, and he was doing it on the calculator, and we had a bit of a competition going on there about who would get to the answer first. So it made it fun, and it made us involved, both of us involved in an experience which is something I treasure to take away.
So the all-important question is, who won the game?
Mum. So yeah, there is good stuff on the horizon, and we took him away on holiday for his birthday in January, and we had some nights when the support staff came over and took over those nights, which gave us a break, but we had some nice experiences with him while we were there, and those are the kind of things I want to start holding on to.
Thank you. It is I've met Mark numerous times, and it's always amused me, because when he always starts going on about his whole genealogy, about whose parents, child, and everything. It always amuses me, and they're far too much. But to hear the context of what you've had to go through, and how you have been a real voice in supporting the social care to make changes, so that people in your situation, in your son's situation, can actually get on with their lives. And I also know you have done a lot of supporting other parents to navigate, because that's kind of how we first met.
Yeah.
Remember, you were involved in a project of telling other parents about direct payments and how to do things to take away some of the fear factor, which we've kind of mentioned as well, about running a business is the basic thing. You've done a lot to help others based on what you've learnt and gone through, and I really appreciate when you tell me about something that's working well, or how you wish something was a bit different, because I know it's your experience and what people are telling you, because they still will, because once they know they've got a source of somebody who knows what's going on, they will talk to them. And I really appreciate hearing it, because it is incredible feedback, and it's really good to know that the feedback that you've given over the last 10 plus many years to the Carers Partnership Board, you've been able to see be deployed, put into use, and how things have improved, and then gone, well, it's improved, but now they can do that, and so move things forward again. And that's really important. So thank you very much for all that you've done in advocating for, not just for yourself and for your son, but for everybody else, because it's been really a pleasure working with you for the last 10 years.
I always want to give something back, because there's no point in being on a journey, a difficult journey, without trying to pave the way better for the next person who's following behind you.
Yes.
And for the networking that's been provided to me, and the insight and the knowledge that I've gained, it's allowed me maybe to make our path slightly smoother. And we know that the Individual Service Fund is still struggling,
So it's good to be able to question
Mm.
and bring back to the board topics that might get lost otherwise. So it's a really important thing, work that you're doing too.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kayla.
Thank you
Thank you very much.